Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Reynolds. I'm Marketing Manager for K-6 Reading, and on behalf of everyone at McGraw-Hill Education, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's presentation on instructional shifts. For many of you, our speaker probably needs no introduction, but for the record, allow me to introduce Dr. Timothy Shanahan. Dr. Shanahan served as a member of the Common Core State Standards Development Team for English Language Arts, grades K-12. He is the former Director of Reading for the Chicago Public Schools, a past president of the International Reading Association, a member of the National Reading Panel and chair of the National Early Literacy Panel, as well as the chair of the National Literacy Panel for Language Minority Children and Youth. And at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where he is currently Professor of Urban Education, he serves as the Director of the Center for Literacy. So without further ado, allow me to present Dr. Tim Shanahan.
Thanks, Jeff. And for all of you who are online, thank you so much for being here. I'm not a huge fan of webinars because I like to see your faces, so I feel like I'm being deprived today, but I'm certainly happy that we're here together. I'm going to, over the next hour, most of the next hour, I'm going to focus on what I see as some of the big instructional shifts brought on by Common Core, things that we're going to have to respond to, and I'll be suggesting what some of these responses might look like. The Common Core is such a profound document. There's so much to it that the notion that I could take on all the big instructional shifts in an hour is, well, it obviously I couldn't do that. I certainly couldn't do that well. And so I'm going to limit myself. There are so many things I could get into with this and that maybe down the road we can do. But for today, I'm really going to limit myself to those things that are really going to have an impact on reading lessons themselves. And all I mean by a reading lesson are those periods of time when an adult is sitting with one or more children, it could be a whole classroom of children, and they're reading some kind of text together. It could be a selection in a core reading program. It could be with something like a reading group. It could be a social studies chapter that a class is reading together under a teacher's supervision, and it could be a teacher sitting one-on-one with a child, taking them through a story or article. So, I think that there's probably nothing more central in a classroom in terms of instruction than what I'm calling a reading lesson. And I believe that the Common Core is really asking us to think about those lessons in very different ways than we have in the past. And so with that, let's just launch into this. The Common Core State Standards movement, the standards movement, the educational standards movement starts in the United States in 1989. At that time, then Governor Bill Clinton, who was head of the National Governors Association, and then President George H.W. Bush, that is Bush 41, had come to an agreement that the governors were really going to lead on educational reform in the United States, and they were going to get some kind of help from the federal government in doing that, but that the reforms that were going to be put in place were going to be standards-based. That is, they were going to be very goal-oriented, and that the states were going to set standards. Well, since that agreement, every state in the Union has adopted standards, and most states have revised them once or twice over that time period. But the fact is, those standards that you've worked with and worked under over the past 20 years have usually not led to very much change, certainly in how teachers teach, and I think in a lot of cases not much change in what they taught. I think in a lot of cases the standards that were put in place pretty much tried to repeat to a great extent what the educators thought was going on in classrooms. With the Common Core, I think it's really different. Although the Common Core State Standards promise not to tell us how to teach, but to put their focus really just on new outcomes, these outcomes are so significantly different that big shifts in teaching are necessitated by the new standards. Uh, some states have been downplaying this shift. I know, and probably some school districts have been doing that as well. I know I was visiting one state this summer. I was talking to a group of school principals and assistant principals, and I started out talking about how big the changes were, and the room burst into laughter. And I thought, well, nothing very funny about that. I was kind of curious, so I moved out into the audience trying to find out what was going on. And what was going on was their State Department of Education people had been there the week before, telling them that they weren't going to need to make many changes because they were already doing the standards. I think, my hunch is that people who are telling you that are trying to motivate you, trying to keep you on board so you don't run away, and that's good. But the fact is, the standards are these standards really are different, and for folks who are saying, "Oh, we've been doing that," I think that they're fooling themselves, and I think that what they're going to do is they're not going to make the educational shifts that are going to be needed. You have certainly lived through standards reforms before. I've lived through, the revisions of standards before, but this time it really is different. And of course, it's amplified to some extent by the new assessments that are coming, the PARC and the Smarter Balanced assessments, which will be aligned with these with the Common Core. Certainly, some of you have probably been online and looked at the prototypes that those groups have put out. Now, those are just preliminary versions of what they think some of their items might look like, but not only are they very consistent with the Common Core, but they're very, very different than the tests that I think most students have been taking. So we really do have to change up how we've been doing things, or we clearly are not going to succeed with these new demands. So with that introduction, let's get into some of these instructional changes, some of these instructional shifts that I think we've got to be nimble about responding to. And certainly there's nothing more central to what I called the reading lesson than the texts themselves. Texts have been, in the past, teachers and reading specialists have worked really hard to try to match texts up to the grade level at which the students are at. Now, all I'm getting at here, just like it says under the how it's been column, if you look at what textbook publishers have done, if you've looked at what school selection committees have done who purchase textbooks, if you look at what the trade books try to do, the books, the individual stories and books that are sold to libraries and parents and schools, these texts have usually been matched to a grade level based on how well students are likely to comprehend the material. If you look at if you're used to looking at things like Lexile levels or any readability levels, that's really what those are meant to tell you. And so if somebody says, a particular readability level is matched to a grade level, what they're saying is books written at that level are probably going to be comprehended by kids at about the 75 to 90% level. I think that's going to change. I think that's going to need to change under the Common Core. I think going forward, instead of matching text to the grade or age at which we think kids will understand that text when they read it, texts need to be matched to the grade level based more on how well we want students to read, what our targets are, what our goals are for those students. Let me show you what I mean by that. If kids are going to hit the Common Core standards, if they're actually going to reach those and reach the career and college readiness goals that we want to see them reach by 12th grade, we're going to have to raise the difficulty level of the texts. The selections in current textbooks simply aren't challenging enough, and the difficulty designations in the books in your book rooms are going to be no longer appropriate. We've known for at least 30 years from research on what happens with students when they leave school, when they go out into the workplace, when they go out into college, and that is that the levels of materials typically confronted in college or in the workplace are about 2 to 3 grade levels above what students are usually asked to read in high school. And so what's happening is we're placing kids in what is fairly easy text for them, but and we move them from grade level to grade level in nice, graded steps. And yet, if they read everything that we give them and everything that typically is part of the high school curriculum, they're going to be about 2 years short of where they need to be. And so the Common Core has really sort of changed things up by very specifically, setting standards that are 2 to 3 years beyond level. And they've done that. They use what are as I say, these different readability measures or readability schemes. They started it, for those of you who looked at the standards when they first came out, they started with Lexiles, and they set Lexile levels higher than in the past, because instead of looking to say what level the kids are they likely to understand a 900 Lexile, they said, what level of Lexiles would we have to get kids to by this grade level if they're going to reach the outcomes they need to? But they've done that now with several other schemes, the ATOS one, the degrees of reading power, Kincaid, reading maturity, SourceRater. These are all good. These are all fine. You can use any of them. You can use all of them. But essentially, the grade level to text matches that we had in the past have changed. And I'm only going to show you that for one of these. I'm going to show it to you for the Kincaid. And the reason I'm doing that is not because this is the best one. They're all fine. You can use all of them, any of them. But unlike those other newer systems, the Kincaid is an old system. It's been around since the 1940s or early 1950s. It's not based on new samples of kids or whatever. So, frankly, I think all these other schemes in some ways are probably a little bit more up to date. And yet, the thing about Kincaid is it states its readability levels in terms of grade levels. And so 20 years ago, if you were using Kincaid and you wanted to know what books to put in a third grade classroom or what books to put in a fourth grade classroom, you'd look at, you'd maybe do a Kincaid analysis and say, oh, the ones that come out at the second grade level go with the second graders, and the ones at the third grade level go with the third graders. And that's what makes it a really interesting one to look at today, because look at this. If you look at this first row here for second and third grade, what the Common Core is saying Kincaid should be is from about a second grade level, 1.98, from a second grade level through about what we would have in the past thought of as a fifth grade level. In other words, that's how much they've moved up the reading levels of the books that they're recommending for these specific levels. And if you follow down that second column, for fourth grade, it's about a high fourth grade level through a seventh grade level. For sixth and eighth grade, it's about, again, a high sixth grade level through what in the past would have been 10th grade level materials, and so on, all the way up through high school like that. If we did exactly the same thing with all those other schemes, the Lexiles and the ADOS and the degrees of reading power, you'd find that Common Core has done exactly the same thing to them. They've taken what those levels might have been in the past, and they've moved them up to, as you can see here, about 2 grade levels by the end of it, so that if kids actually work with these texts at these levels and do it successfully, they're going to end up reading about 2 grade levels higher than in the past. How do we respond to that particular shift or that particular demand? Well, there are some short-term things and there are some long-term ones. Certainly one of the short-term ones is you already have textbooks in place in a lot of cases. Those textbooks were designed not necessarily to get kids to these high levels. And so starting to supplement current textbooks with additional or replacement selections that are at these higher levels, that give kids opportunities to read these kinds of materials despite the fact that your textbook might not reach those kinds of levels would certainly be one of the kinds of things you can do, right away. You don't have to wait. In terms of, obviously there are a lot of schools that don't use textbooks, and they have book rooms, and in the past they've had particular books aligned with particular grade levels, and it's probably time you rethink those matches. If you had little blue dots on particular books, maybe they need little red dots to move them over to some other shelves or some other parts of the room, so that those end up in the 4th grade instead of in the 5th grade or whatever. So those are a couple of quick ones. And of course, as you move forward, as you buy new text materials, and obviously reading is the big one, but you can really think about this in terms of your science materials and your social studies materials and health books and anything that you have kids reading. You should be looking for opportunities to start stretching them up, to start to make sure that kids are having opportunities in their classrooms to do the kinds of challenging reading that will actually enable them to meet these standards, to succeed on these assessments, and most importantly, to be prepared for college and career. Now, something that I didn't tell you at the beginning of this is you are allowed to ask questions. There is I'm told on your screens, there's a question box, and so if you have questions, I would appreciate it if you would start putting those in, and I've asked Jeff to follow those, and at the end of each of these points that I want to make, I will have one of these how to respond screens, and I'll try to stop at these points, so that if there's some questions that Jeff wants to communicate to me, I can take them as we go instead of saving it all for the end. So that's how we're going to proceed from here. So that's one big change to the texts themselves. And so now let me jump us forward to another shift in instruction that I think is going to be important. This one also involves the text, but it's not just what's available in the classroom. In the How It's Been column here, item 2, teachers have placed students in out-of-grade level materials to ensure that the text won't be too hard. In the past, teachers have worked very hard with a lot of advice and direction from people like me, telling them to make sure that they got kids to their instructional level. But under the Common Core, I think you're going to find a greater need to focus students on grade level materials in a lot of cases, even if those might be hard for the kids, or even when we are putting kids in easier materials, we have to really keep our focus on how are we going to stretch those kids, how are we going to move from those lower levels to the higher levels, which has not always been the focus in the past. I think most of you would admit or agree to. So let's talk about this one a little bit. I have vivid memories. Pretty much every year I spend a lot of time in classrooms, and one of the things that teachers will often say to me when we talk about standards is that they're teaching the standards, their grade level standards, just like they're supposed to, but that they're often teaching them using reading materials from a lower grade level. So it might be a 4th grade teacher who says, oh, I teach the 4th grade standards, but I teach it with 2nd grade books because these kids, that's where their instructional level is. In other words, same standards but different text. I think the Common Core has really emphasized to a great extent and made a lot of people aware of the fact that teaching grade level standards in a context that's as simple as text a couple of years below level is really not teaching those standards. You're not really preparing kids to do the work that they have to do, and that is a serious problem. Of course, this notion of differentiating instruction is an important one, but I'm afraid for a lot of teachers, it's kind of a simplistic one. We, instead of really differentiating instruction and helping kids from different points to get to where we need them to be, I'm afraid in a lot of cases what we've done is just sort of shifted our instruction to the levels that where kids are now, and not really done the hard work of trying to raise their levels and get them to stretch and to be able to do things they can't do now. Now, under Common Core, it is certainly still okay to do some out-of-level teaching. In fact, I would really stress this not only with the lowest kids, but with everybody. Those Common Core bands that have been set, those grade level reading level bands that have been set, are not the only levels at which students are allowed to work in. They're just the levels at which we want to make sure kids reach, that they get to the top levels of those by those grade levels. And to do that, I mean, frankly, I think it's going to be important that kids read a pretty wide range of materials, both easier and harder materials. A steady diet of easy text certainly doesn't raise the level of students, which is a criticism of what we've done in the past, but a steady diet of texts all at one level or all at that are hard for kids isn't necessarily going to get them there either. And so it's really critical that we not only make a real effort to try to teach kids more and more at grade level, but when we do see a good reason to differentiate and to move them to an easier piece of material, we really have to have a plan for how we're going to move that youngster from that easier material to the harder level material, and that just hasn't been happening very much. Let's talk about what some of the shifts are, and one I just mentioned. We've got to get away from this notion that everything these youngsters read has to be at their instructional level. That just isn't the case. The research doesn't really support that. I don't have I'm not going to spend a lot of time on research in our talk here just because our time is so short. But the small numbers of studies that we have on this certainly do not lead one to believe that if you put kids in easier text that they're necessarily going to succeed. Their comprehension for that text will certainly go up, but their learning from it in terms of becoming better readers isn't necessarily going to get there. So this notion of let's get everybody to their instructional level, and then as long as they're placed in books at that level, they're going to be fine. That's a shift we've got to make. We can't just do that anymore. That isn't good enough, even if that approach of having the kids read some easier material might be part of what we do. Certainly one thing I would suggest we should, well, before I move on from that, let me just add one thing. I said a moment ago that students shouldn't just read easy material, and I'd said earlier, and they shouldn't just read hard material. I think this aspect of reading development probably is more analogous, more similar to physical exercise, physical development, than it is to intellectual development. I honestly think that students need a varied exercise routine if they're going to build muscle. They need some intensive, challenging work, whether that's running really hard or whether that's trying to lift something that's kind of heavy, or whether that's doing certain kinds of calisthenics or swim strokes. But in fact, they can't do all of their work at really challenging levels or really hard levels, or they'll just exhaust themselves. I think we need to start thinking of our reading routines more like those kinds of exercise routines that some of us engage in our running or our cycling or our swimming or our weightlifting. And what that really means is you do some work with really light weights. You do some running at maybe some short distances where you run very hard for short periods of time, and then you go longer distances where maybe you don't run quite as hard or quite as fast. And I think it's the same thing here. We want students to be engaged in some really a range of experiences of both easier for them and harder texts, and again for them, that will really help them to put on muscle. That also means you don't always just raise levels. It's not, oh, you start with Lexile 700 and then you do Lexile 710 and then you read a story at Lexile 720 and so on until you reach the goal. I think, again, it's probably a lot more like exercise. If you're getting ready for a marathon, you run 3 miles on the first day, you run 3 miles on the second day, and then you run a 4. then you drop back to a 3 again. And you say, well, why would you drop back? Well, because you need to give your muscles, a rest. You'll be able to run faster for 3 miles than you could for the 4, and so on and so forth. So you'll build more strength, and then you run another 3, and then you run a 5, then you run a 4 mile. There's this sort of moving up and moving down, back, doing some heavy work and then doing some easier work, doing longer routines at easier challenge levels, doing shorter routines at very intensive levels. And so that might be analogous to, for example, reading a short text that's very hard and very challenging and requires a great deal of demand, and then reading a longer text that's maybe at a somewhat easier level that doesn't require quite as much effort on your part to get through, but of course it's longer, so you have to sustain the effort longer. I think we need to be smarter about that. Instead of just moving kids to easier text, I think we need routines that are aimed at very much like the marathon training routine that I referred to. The goal of that is by the end of it, you'll be able to run 26 miles. The routines we put in place for kids in terms of these reading levels and difficulty challenges, I think need to ensure that by the end they're able to read materials at the levels that smarter, balanced, and park and real life is going to require that these kids be able to read. So I think that's all pretty important. I guess one last thought I'd add to that I've been mentioning to audiences and people find useful is, if the Common Core has said that 5th graders are supposed to be able to read a certain level of degrees of reading power or lexiles or whatever by the end of the year, I wouldn't necessarily say that's my goal. You might want to even set a somewhat higher goal than that. So if they said 1,000 lexiles was where the kids needed to be by the end, and so it's possible that your test would be on that. I'm not sure that just sort of trying to reach that and get your toes wet there is the point. You might try to give kids experience with text a little bit higher than that before the end of the year, so that they're they're stretched a little bit. So when they are doing things like being tested at, say, 1100 level, they're actually, that isn't the hardest text they've ever read. So you get the idea. Another kind of idea along these lines has to do with a kind of a shift might be, before students take on a really hard text, have them do some fluency practice or do some parsing of the text first, so you sort of break sentences down into their constituent parts, their noun phrases and verb phrases and so on. Why would you do that? Well, to give kids a leg up on being able to make sense of the text when you turn your attention to comprehension. What we've tended to do in the past is we'll focus the kids' attention on comprehending the text at their instructional level, so a text we hope won't be too hard for them. And then we go back maybe and do fluency practice to build their reading skills. What I'm really suggesting is, in some cases, we're going to ask kids to read texts that are hard enough that doing some fluency practice up front will actually serve to improve their ability to handle that specific text. And in fact, there's research showing that. Another possibility is we these days can do things like use stair-step books or apprentice texts to help students to read information at various levels. Let's say you're trying to have students read a science article on magnets, and the material's written at the level that you think is appropriate to Common Core, and yet the students you're worried about, in the past you would have put them in an easier text. Now you want them to read that text, but they're going to struggle with it. Perhaps supplementing that text with another one or maybe a couple of other texts on the same topic, so again on magnets, but written at easier levels. And not necessarily the exact same information, but certainly with overlap. And so the notion would be that the student would climb these like stair steps. You'd have some students in your class who could read the hard one, and they wouldn't need a lot of preparation for it. You'd have other students who would struggle with it, so you'd have them read one or two of these easier texts, not instead of the target text, but in preparation for it, so that when they take on that harder text, it's a little bit easier, but it'd be a challenge they'd be taking on themselves. And then finally, my earlier point, when students are taught out of level, when you really do have a student who's far behind and you feel like you need to give them considerable work with easier material, and that can be a legitimate decision if the student's low enough. Uh, you cannot just stick them at that easier level and hope that's going to be okay. You really do have to have a scheme, whether it's the kind of stair steps notion that I just talked about, whether it's that you're going to have them read certain selections at that easier level, and you're going to still have them doing some of the regular classwork with the harder material as well. You need a plan that doesn't just have them languishing in those low levels, or we'll lose those students. We're losing them now. Common Core is really encouraging us not to do that. And given that, Jeff, I don't know if there are any questions that have come in that you'd like to jump in with here, but this would be a good spot.
Okay. There's actually been several questions about variety of texts and levels to use as scaffolding.
Are there any easy questions?
But I actually think you answered that one. Let's see. This was an interesting question, I thought. Can you put a percentage on the maximum of time that should be allowed for out-of-level reading, either below or above?
Some of the people who put together the Common Core, like David Coleman, early on had made some statement or put out a document where they'd given some percentages like that. And to their credit, at some point they withdrew those estimates. The honest answer is I honestly don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I used the sports analogy earlier of the weightlifters and the runners and the swimmers and so on, and how they vary their routines. They literally spend millions of dollars trying to figure out what the best routines are, and to not do work that's either too heavy or too easy, and to organize that in a sensible way. And when you look at what we've invested on that in schools, this is a big question. We really don't know. So what I'd really have to say to you is I don't have a specific percentage to give you. I think that the point that we have to always be aimed at is we've got to get whatever level that youngster's comfortable with, that he can do fairly good comprehension with, we've got to very, very quickly, once we ascertain what that is, we have to start making him uncomfortable. We have to start reaching above that. And so I don't have a real specific to give you. I think the one that David had put out was something like you couldn't spend more than 10% of the time on that. And we honestly don't know. I would say a couple things. One, make sure you're spending at least some time regularly where the kids really are trying to read at least some part of the text that is at these specified levels. If they never get the opportunity to do that, they're going to be in big trouble. But again, don't give anybody a steady dose of any sort of level of text. You can vary this up and down to try to get kids to the highest level possible. But I honestly don't have a good percentage. There's no research that'll give me one, and I'm not just going to make it up and tell you that.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to say that to everyone who's asking questions, there are a lot, and I know that in the time we've got here, we're not going to get to all of you, so I'm going to try to pick the ones that have the widest ramifications for everyone, in hopes that will be the best thing to do.
Jeff, do we have any way of after this, do we have emails of people so that if we want to deal with some of these questions even after the broadcast, we could put something out and write into them? Is that possible?
I would like to do that, and I think we should plan on doing that. Yes.
Okay, then we will try to do that, folks. So I'm not going to ignore you, but I put way too many slides in here. So why don't we move on, and we'll in the next section, I'll give you a chance again, Jeff, to jump in. Okay, another shift. The way it's been is when books are challenging for kids, when for whatever reason the book was harder than you thought, you weren't, this is you group in your reading group, but you're not able to group when you work with the science book, for whatever it is. Teachers often come across situations where the kids really are struggling with the books. And the teacher's response to that has generally been to either read such books to the kids or to tell them what the books say. And I think under Common Core, that the how it will be is we need to get out of those procedures. We have to stop doing that. Teachers need to support students' own attempts to read challenging texts and without telling them what the books say. And that's a really important shift and one that we need to talk about. Certainly finding appropriately challenging text is only part of the solution. I started with that first item where just making sure that you have such books in your classrooms, in your school, that you have selections there that are hard enough. That is an issue, and yet it's the easy issue. Once you have those books there, once you're placing kids in materials, just by definition of what I've described to you, you're going to have kids who are going to struggle with harder text. They're going to be asked to read things that are harder than they've been asked to read in the past. Teachers like to protect kids from struggle. Let's face it. A lot of teachers become teachers because they like kids, and they want those kids to be happy. Well, and that's important. That's not a bad thing, but in fact, if kids are going to learn, they have to struggle. And so the point isn't to make kids unhappy or to frustrate them or to get them to cry. The point is to help them to struggle successfully, to take on this harder text and to work with it. Certainly this notion of I don't want my kids to struggle because it'll frustrate them, therefore I can take care of that, and the way teachers take care of it is and this has been documented, I've certainly seen it hundreds, maybe thousands of times in classroom. The teacher will either read the text to the students, or if the kids are a little bit older, a lot of times the teacher knows which kids in the class are good readers. They'll have them read it to everybody else. Or I was in a classroom just a week or two ago, and the teacher had an audio tape. She just played the tape to the kids. And they could follow along in the text, which, there are times and there can be benefits to that. But if this is really meant to be the material that kids are learning to read from, if they're really supposed to know how to read that social studies book or whatever it is, just either telling them what that text said or reading that to them does not make those kids stronger with reading. You might see it as kind, but in fact it's a kind of unintentional cruelty, because instead of helping these kids to move forward and to be able to take on that harder text, what's really happening is we're making sure that the child doesn't even get the opportunity to try to do that. What am I suggesting in place of this kind of getting the kids the information but not really getting them the reading experience that will make them stronger? I think there are a number of things. I certainly think one of the things we have to do, obviously I mentioned a couple on that previous slide on the previous how to shift, but on this one I would say teachers need to take a good, careful look at the material that they're asking students to read. I think it's absolutely critical that we start to hone our abilities to anticipate why a particular text is hard, what it is that's blocking the students, what might interfere with their understanding. I think that's absolutely critical. Not always with the idea of heading it off, not always with the idea of, I figured out which words they're going to have trouble with, so I'll pre-teach those vocabulary. That has its place, but sometimes, frankly, whatever it is that you thought was hard, maybe there were particular sentences that you thought were particularly complicated. Maybe you thought that the structure of the text was carrying a lot of the meaning and you were worried that the kids weren't going to notice the structure. Maybe the author's tone. I know I was reading a children's book recently, and the narrator is a little girl, and she has a very smart mouth. This is a very sarcastic child, and so the tone of this text is very sarcastic. And unless you recognize the tone and what the author is doing with that tone, you're really not going to appreciate this book very much. And so any of those kinds of things can trip kids up or interfere with their understanding. And you could try to get out in front and tell the kids about those ahead of time so that they're not confused by them or they don't fail to notice them. But sometimes what you want to do is you just want to anticipate. You want to recognize that those are going to be problems or potential problems, and then you want to Maybe ask the youngsters a question when you get to that point in the text that where they can reveal whether they're understanding what's going on or not, and if they don't, then maybe you break down that sentence and look at it together and try to figure it out. Maybe you engage the kids in trying to figure out the tone and maybe give them some guidance there, or try to connect some ideas, or start to look for structural clues. So there are lots of different things you can do, but the very best thing, the most important, is read the text yourself and figure out what's hard about it. And I really think this is easier for teachers to do when they're working with other teachers. And so this might be something where the third grade teachers sit down together and look at the day's selections and try to work that through together. Publishers can help on that too, but nothing like reading it yourself. Certainly being prepared to guide the students. Let's say what you thought was so confusing was there were so many pronouns in this particular section of the text that frankly you thought the kids were going to get confused about who was being talked about in a particular time and who the he was that was saying this or that. You very well might, in a case like that, have a plan where you can go in and start to draw the connecting lines between the characters and the pronouns. And so, that might be something that you start out doing and you have the kids do. Earlier I mentioned the idea maybe there are a couple sentences that are just really complicated, really long and convoluted, and maybe they've hidden their verbs or some such thing. And maybe that's something you put up on a chart and you're ready to go, so that if you ask kids about the ideas in that sentence and they don't get it, now you can start to diagram that sentence. You can start to break it down. You can start to, let's find the noun, let's find the verb, and help the kids, show them how to think about it, so that they can really do it themselves. And certainly one of the most important ideas that I can think of on this is rereading is really important. My colleague Doug Fisher says something that I think is just profoundly wise. He says, in the past we selected relatively easy texts and we expected the kids to understand it in a single read. Now we're going to be giving kids challenging text, and to really understand a challenging text, you've got to read it and reread it. And so it's going to be really critically important that we not give in to this sort of notion that kids will be bored if they have to read something twice. I mean, remember, this is the generation that can watch a video 37 times. I promise you, reading a really good piece of literature or a really good article on science or history is not going to be deadly boring if the kids have to do some work to figure that out. And again, Jeff, if you want to jump in, this would be a good time.
Okay, maybe a couple here where we've got a little opportunity. I thought this one was interesting, Tim. Are there any studies about how shifts like these impact student achievement?
In terms of these text difficulty ones, I think we'd all be embarrassed at how few studies there are. The handful of studies on this that look at the connection of text difficulty to achievement, however, do suggest that placing students in materials as easy as we've been placing them in actually slows down their learning progress rather than speeding it up. And we have that both from correlational studies where people go out into schools and measure how hard the books are the kids are reading, and then look at their growth so that there's no intervention and you don't quite know what's going on, but you can correlate these. And what you tend to find is that the kids who are in the somewhat harder materials do better than the ones who are in the materials at the levels that we've been telling people to place them in. And there's at least one experimental study that's very well done where they essentially identified a bunch of kids' reading levels and then purposely either place them at what in the past we've called an instructional level, or put them in materials markedly harder than what someone like Tim Shanahan would have been telling you just a few years ago. And in fact, what they put them in were materials that were 2 years or 4 years above the kids' reading level. So we're talking really frustration level materials. And what they found was the biggest learning gains went not to the kids who were placed at their instructional level, but to the kids who were placed in the materials that were 2 to 4 years harder. I think what the reason why that works is because if you're going to learn, you have to have opportunity to learn. I think we've been placing kids in materials where there might be a little bit for them to learn there, but not very much. And by placing them in harder materials, you open up that possibility that the kid can learn something, that there is actually something there that they don't know that they can figure out. But think about that. Opportunity to learn isn't the same thing as learning. And so in some ways, the Common Core is saying, gee, if kids are going to learn to swim, they have to be in deeper water. So let's move them out away from, they can't be where they can just stand up. We got to get them out where they can really swim. And that, I think that makes sense. Getting them into deeper water, it would certainly help them to be able to swim. And yet, just putting somebody in deep water is, you might drown them. You're not necessarily going to teach them to swim. And that's why it's so critically important that we do more than just stick kids in hard text, that we really do have this kind of guided rereading, that we really do have teachers there who are thinking about what's challenging about this text and how am I going to help kids with that. That teachers aren't just heading it off by telling the kids what it says, but are really requiring the kids to do the work. Holding their hands, helping them, giving them the kind of guidance that was emphasized on this slide, but certainly not just throwing them in deep water.
Okay, maybe one more before we continue.
Okay.
Do these instructional shifts also apply to intervention programs at all grade levels?
I honestly think they do. I don't know that, you really have decisions to make when you have a pull-out program, for your RTI programs or just, even a typical old Title I, reading program. I think there are lots of different ways you could structure those experiences, and I think we don't have great research on this. You're going to have to feel your way along. It could be, that question earlier about, gee, is it okay to spend some time with the youngsters reading something that's easier for them? You very well might want to set that up where that happens not in the classroom, but down the hall when the kid's doing that kind of pull-out work. And what you'd want that reading teacher or that special teacher to be doing would not just be moving the kids to that easier materials, but now that you're working in this small group and you're in this advantage situation, I want you, if this kid was working at a 600, I want you to try to move them to a 650, and let's see if we can do that over the next 4 or 5 weeks. You'd have that kind of thing going on there. That's one way to think of it. Another possibility, however, would be no, I want the teacher in the classroom to work with a wider range of material and to have, to have the kids spending some of the time working with easier materials. But what I want that teacher down the hall to do in that advantage situation is I want her to sit with that really small group with that really hard text that maybe we're about to read in the classroom and do some of this hard work that I was just talking about. To prepare kids for that, so that they do better with that in the classroom. I don't know that it matters which way you set that up. I think you got to look at your personnel and your situation and maybe even the kids' levels to make those decisions. But the idea that more than one person is working on these problems and that maybe they're taking different parts of it is important. So I do think that it's very reasonable to have that teacher down the hall even doing work at these really hard levels simply because she might be in the more advantaged position to work really closely with the student and to guide him and to keep him motivated so that he takes on this really big challenge. So with that, again, let me jump forward because we're burning time fast here. I don't have a lot of time and I had 2 more points. Let's see if I can manage to make them both. Again, staying with this lesson and the text and everything, teachers in the past have taught reading with a predominance of stories and literary nonfiction, such as biographies and such. With Common Core, you really need to balance instruction between informational and literary text. Now this one, frankly, we've been changing on this one over the last several years. This has been an issue in American education for at least a couple of generations now. We have tended to teach kids to read mainly out of storybooks. Yeah, there have been a few other little texts, scrunched through there, but the fact is we we've largely used stories and poems and plays. And while some schools do have social studies books or science books, classroom observations would suggest that kids don't spend very much time reading much of that material. Sometimes that's read to them, sometimes it's not read at all, unfortunately. Um, Informational text refers to text that it focuses on information about classes of things or events in the natural or social world. I think the example I've been using is if it's an article about how porpoises communicate, that would be an example of something that exists in the natural world, and it's a class of things. It's how this whole these animals communicate. That would fit in the informational text scheme. The story of Flipper might be a true story, but that's really about, that's like the biography of Flipper. It's the biography of one porpoise. It's not really telling us about how porpoises live in the natural world, what we learn from them, how they communicate, what they, how they function, and so on and so forth. And so the one is really informational text, and the other one, the Flipper one, tends to end up being a story about Flipper. It's not, it might be true, but it's a lot more like what we've normally had kids read in their story books. And so the idea here is we want to expand these kids' reading horizons so they're reading texts that really have a wider range of features and characteristics and structures. Frankly, students do too little of this kind of reading in school, and so it's not that literature isn't important, it's just that literature isn't the only important thing. And so what Common Core has pushed for in the elementary years is that students really be spending about half their time reading literature and about half their time reading this, more informational kinds of text. And I think that's really a terrific good thing for our kids. This little Venn diagram gets at the point I was making a moment ago with the difference between where biographies fit and so on. In some people's schemes, biography fits in informational text because it's factual, and in some people's schemes it fits in literary because it tends to be a story. And so what these overlapping circles suggest is, there are times when informational text uses literary features, or where literary text might use informational text features. I know somebody was showing me recently a novel where they'd actually, for some reason, the author had used bullet points. I usually only see bullet points in informational text. This author was kind of playing with the genre a little bit. The point is not that there isn't an overlap, but the whole idea of expanding kids to informational text is to move them from that literary circle and to make sure they're getting sufficient experience in that informational text circle to develop. And so the idea isn't that it's bad to look at anything in that intersection, but let's make sure that when we're asking kids to read informational text, that we really are experiencing that whole other circle, that they're not just doing the stuff that's close to literature. And again, in terms of the shifts, seeking supplements for current textbooks and book rooms that have tended to be heavily weighted towards literature. Now, if you've bought a core program in the last 2 or 3 years, it's probably weighted something like 60% literature and 40% informational. So you wouldn't necessarily have a lot of supplementing to do. If you've got a core program that's maybe 8 or 10 years old, I bet it's more like 80% literature and 20% informational text. And you'll have a lot more supplementing to do in a case like that. Certainly, as you replace textbooks, get texts that use more informational text. You shouldn't have to scramble around to find what you need, especially if you're buying those kinds of products. Emphasize in your elementary schools the reading experience and content subjects to a greater extent. I'm afraid in a lot of schools that's just sort of fallen away, in part because we don't talk about it. We don't make a big deal out of it. And so the teacher really focuses on reading in the reading class when she has a lot of literature, and it's not focused on so much in the science class where actually there'd be some terrific things to read. And certainly make sure that your teachers recognize what distinguishes informational and literary text so that they don't just go into that overlapping part of those two circles, and that they really give kids the full experience. Let me jump to this last item. I want to make sure I get them all in today. And here's the last one, and that is under the Common Core in that reading lesson. In the past, teachers have integrated a lot of skills work and strategy teaching and emphasis on kids' backgrounds and things like that into the guided reading, into that period when the kids are reading the text with the teacher's supervision. Under the Common Core, it's not that you can't do any of those things, but you're going to need to balance those kinds of activities with a greater emphasis on the text alone through what's been called close reading. And so again, let me unpack this for you a bit. Guided reading lessons focus students on reading text under that adult supervision or with that adult assistance. Typically what that's meant in the prototypical lesson is the teacher starts out with, let me tell you what this story is going to be about. Let me give you a purpose for reading. Let's talk about what experiences you guys have that are relevant to it, or if I don't think you do, what background can I teach you about this? And then we'll read the text a single time, and as we read it, if some decoding skill that we wanted to teach or talk about comes up, we'll talk about it, or grammar skill, or all kinds of things. And what I've labeled these in that second bullet point, the very last word, distractions. It's a lot of focus on good stuff, and yet it's getting kids away from the actual text they're reading. The Common Core is really saying one of the outcomes of schooling should be that students should be able to read a text deeply and intentionally and with a lot of critical response and a deep understanding, and that means at least some of their time needs to be spent in engaging in that, where the focus isn't on their reading skills but on the actual text they're reading. We need to make sure that our teachers know how to teach close readings of text, how to guide rereadings, to emphasize different layers of meaning. One of the things that I really push for is that on a first reading, the teacher focuses very much on what the text says. On a second reading, let's focus on how the text worked. What did the author do to convey those ideas? What was the structure? What language choices were made? And certainly this idea of how to ask text-dependent questions, how to really not just get the kids involved talking about their own backgrounds, but to really focus on what the text said. Certainly, to make that work, we have to identify texts that are rich enough to support this kind of analysis, but also brief enough to allow such intensive reading and such repetition of reading to fit into a classroom schedule. And finally, with those things like background knowledge and purpose setting, again, there were people out there who were saying you couldn't do any of that. They've backed away from all of that. But we need to be smart about it. We need to be strategic. We need to limit how much of that we do to really put the emphasis on the youngster figuring out the text instead of this sort of ritual that has crept up around reading. I think with that, Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you to close it up because I think I've finished it off.
Okay, I appreciate that, Tim. Thank you very much. Do you have time for a couple?
I do. I'm fine with it. If
A couple
our
quick
audience
answers,
does,
maybe?
sure,
A couple
go
quick
for it.
answers. This Common Core call for a 50-50 split between literary and nonfiction. But when we're using those, quote, reach texts with kids, would you recommend using more informational than literary?
No, I really wouldn't. I really, I've talked about varying text difficulties and how you don't want to just sort of get stuck. And I would say, you're honestly going to find that kids struggle to handle the language demands of both kinds of texts. And so I wouldn't. There might be times when I strategically decide, gee, my kids are really struggling with this kind of a science material or whatever. So let me start out with something easier and work up to this. You might do some things like that, but generally it wouldn't be, oh, I use easy this and hard that. I would really want a range for both kinds of reading. It's a really interesting question. It's a good question.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe one last one here. And I'm asking this because it's something that I've asked myself many times. In the Common Core, there are a lot of subtle differences as you move from grade to grade. For example, in K2, key ideas and details, one grade talks about retelling, whereas the next grade talks about recounting.
Yeah.
Can you offer us any help as we try to interpret the subtleties?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I've been asked this before. I've been asked this a number of times, and I've looked at it really hard. And I got to tell you, I think some of those aren't subtleties. They're just the variation of the English language. To tell you the truth, nobody is, you know, those particular differences, like retelling and recounting, I don't think was really meant to convey any deep, important distinction. I do think there are, the person who asked the question is absolutely right. There are some shifts across grade levels. There are some real differences in key ideas and details as you move up in terms of how much it moves away from just being, can the kids show us that they understood the text, to can the kids actually use the information to support their own arguments and their own, opinions and so on and so forth. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention to those big shifts that take place, and yet people are noticing these really small wording changes and thinking that there's some deep idea there, there's some nuance that they're supposed to be grasping. I think in this one and many of those other ones, those really aren't the important differences, and they didn't mean anything, and those were really meant to be close synonyms, and so they're really talking about very similar things at those two levels, not really differences.
Okay, thank you for that. And with that, we're going to close it out here. Everyone who joined in, thank you for being with us. For all of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, we're going to try to follow up with you afterwards to the best of our ability. Again, thank you.
And we're going to find a way to make this PowerPoint available to you if you want it.
In our follow-up, we'll give you a link to where it will be posted. So,
good luck, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.